All right, if we can get started. Hello, good. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here. In spite of Canadian fires, thank you all for coming. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Lorenzo Vidino. I'm the director of the program on extremism here at George Washington University. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all to our conference, Terrorism and Violent Extremism in Africa, which we have the pleasure of hosting together with our partners at the Bridgeway Foundation. We're extremely excited to host today's event, which features a diverse group of high-profile government officials and experts from a variety of African countries and from the US. This diversity of perspectives and expertise will help us better understand the current dynamic of what is now considered by most experts and government officials the epicenter of jihadism today, globally. In fact, I would say while the central leaderships of ISIS and Al-Qaeda have recently suffered critical losses, they are increasingly unable to function efficiently. Many of their global affiliates worldwide have gained in size, sophistication, and lethality. This is particularly true when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, where several local groups, also thanks to their affiliation to the global brands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, have managed to grow exponentially in recent years. Here at the Program on Extremism, together with our partners at Bridgeway, have long been trying to analyze some of these dynamics. In particular, how the partnership between local groups and global brands functions and what advantages it brings to each party. We did so with our 2021 report, The Islamic State in Congo, which provided substantial evidence to prove that ISIS had a presence in the DRC. And this week, we're excited to have released Bridgeway's latest report, Fatal Transaction, the funding behind the Islamic State's Central Africa province, which was featured in the Washington Post on Monday, a very good piece on it, and that details a very sophisticated funding mechanism for ISIS that spans a good part of the African continent. The excellent speakers that we have today will talk to us about some of these dynamics and, most importantly, what to do about them. I don't want to speak further, but before I invite Laren to make his initial remarks, I'd like to just provide a couple of housekeeping rules, which I'm generally terrible at doing, being Italian and somewhat anarchic, but rules will come. The first one, so thanks Liz actually for putting it together otherwise. The first one is that we have printed brochures with the agenda, and they are at the check-in table. I hope most of you already picked them up. There are also hard copies of the newest Bridgeway report, along with QR codes if you prefer to access the document electronically. The first part, and only the first part, of the event is being live streamed. A link can be found on our website, and the recording of the event, again, only the first part, will be uploaded next week. After each panel, we will have questions from the audience. Our team will walk around with microphones during the Q&A portion, and also people following us online can type their questions, and we'll do our best to have the moderators ask those questions. Finally, again, despite Canadian fires and smoke and whatever other thing nature has decided to toss at us, I'd like to invite you after the event to our cocktail reception, which will conclude the event, so from 5:30 onwards. Again, thank you so much for coming. This is a great turnout, and I'm very excited about that. Without further ado, Lauren, please.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Yes, my voice does sound like this. I have 2 young kids at home. It's a hazard of raising young, active boys, my wife tells me. Or it's the Canadian fires, I don't know. But bear with me. My name is Laren Poole. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Bridgeway Foundation. We are very excited and honored to have you guys here today to do this, co-host this event, exploring the rise of ISIS in Africa. My CEO of the foundation, Shannon Sedgwick Davis, and I and our team are here, Congo, Nairobi, Kampala, London. We are spread out throughout the globe as a foundation with one mission: to stop war crimes crimes against humanity, and genocide. It's a audacious mission that our founder set out to accomplish in the early 90s, and we have long been trying to accomplish this. Today, we have brought together a diverse set of individuals from the US government, from the DRC government, from the Ugandan government, that are trying to grapple with this problem. We at the foundation have undertook two simple programs ourselves to try to defund ISIS and to try to get individuals from the Islamic State in Central Africa to defect. They are non-kinetic, but we believe we can erode the group's ability to commit violence against people in DRC. And it's been generously funded by the Howard Buffett Foundation. The CEO is here today. And Kelly, thank you very much for that support. And today we understand that this problem is not only affecting DRC, Somalia, Mozambique, but the continent at wide. And so you're going to hear people who are studying this from the Sahel all the way down to South Africa. And we at the foundation have the luxury, I say it's a luxury, my staff might not really believe in this, but to focus on ending genocide. They often say that's the most audacious or impossible mission of all time. But I understand from the RSVPs, a lot of you work in the US government for various agencies. And so I say luxury because we have a singular mission. And I know you guys are all charged with a broad set of goals to accomplish for promoting US foreign policy. And I want to make one appeal to you today. I understand the war on counterterrorism is no longer the priority for our government. I know that these problems are difficult, but in the great power competition that is currently is at the focus of our foreign policy, helping our African allies and partners and friends solve these issues now is the best way to develop a relationship with them and a partnership. If we want influence on the continent moving forward, we have to address these needs practically and quickly. The foundation, we care about saving lives. I understand that you have other priorities for your agency, but I believe that these two things can align. And so today's event is in hopes it's creating relationships here at the cocktail hour, which I know we're all very excited about, but also understanding each other's perspectives and understanding what can be done. We have an individual, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, from DRC, who has interviewed hundreds of fighters coming out of the Islamic State. And the most interesting thing about when I talked to him, Sakombe, is that he talks about these fighters as almost they are victims. They're victims that have joined this group. They've been lured, they've been tricked. They're young, they're impressionable. While ISIS is an ideological group, it does not mean that every fighter is ideologically driven. There are shades of commitment. And we can peel those shades away and rob them of their ability to kill people. And I'm very excited about those creative ideas and how to work together to solve them. And also, I just want to remind you that a lot of these African nations, this is their 9/11. They haven't experienced the war on terror. And so they're in different places, coming along, understanding the problem set, coming up with different solutions. And I think that's an opportunity for us to share our experience, lessons learned, and also to partner with them to understand their context and their view of it, which is very exciting when I think about trying to stop crimes against humanity. So thank you guys very much for attending today. I know in a post-COVID world, getting together like this is like something of a novelty. It's very exciting for me. And thank you for caring and dedicating your afternoon to this. So without further ado, I'd like to invite the first panel up and discuss our moderator. Do you want to introduce it? Sure. All right, thank you.
Okay. Yes, we're on. Okay. Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, Laren. It's a privilege to be with all of you guys here today. We've got two panels. The first one will be on the threat of the Islamic State in Africa, and then after that, we'll be talking about what we can do policy-wise in terms of containing this threat. A very distinguished and exciting panel with us. I'll give some brief remarks and then introduce them and hand it over to them for some of their prepared remarks, and then we'll have plenty of time also for questions. My name is Tara Canlin. I'm the Vice President of Research and Analysis at Bridgeway Foundation. So the report that is on that table, for better or for worse, that's us. That was my team. So hopefully you like it. If not, would love to hear any complaints as well. Any information you have. All feedback is welcome on that one. But to give a little bit of context to our panel, so the Islamic State has been in Africa since the beginning of its territorial caliphate, its proclaimed caliphate. As in other parts of the world, in the Middle East and South Asia, they've primarily taken existing groups, pre-existing jihadi groups or networks, often from Al-Qaeda, and they've created new Islamic State affiliates there. So just after declaring its caliphate in June 2014, the insurgent groups and splinters from Al-Qaeda in North Africa were the first ones to pledge allegiance to the Islamic State and be recognized as so-called provinces by the group's central leadership. Over the next several years, this has continued across the continent, and now you have Islamic State provinces or affiliates from Somalia down to Mozambique, from Libya to Nigeria. Among the most recent is the former ADF, or Allied Democratic Forces, which is now the Islamic State Central Africa province in DRC. That is the one that we at Bridgeway Foundation are most fully focused on. But the Islamic State's expansion into Africa has offered these affiliates some very important things: notoriety, membership in a global organization, and most importantly, financing and recruitment potential. So at its height, when the Islamic State had its territorial caliphate in Iraq and Syria, it controlled one of the largest war chests that we've seen in a terrorist organization. Some estimates go as high as $1 billion. And so they were able to use this money to create these affiliates and fund their expansion across Africa. Now we see that there are at least 6 active provinces, as well as others that are currently dormant, and supporters or affiliates in a number of countries. So there are actually fewer African countries that are not affected by the Islamic State at this point than that are between the affiliates and the provinces. Collectively, these African affiliates have killed tens of thousands of people. They contest or openly control areas in Sahel, Nigeria, Somalia, Mozambique, and they've threatened or physically attacked Western interests in a lot of these places, the most notorious of which is the 2017 Tongo attack in Niger, where we lost 4 American servicemen. And now the Islamic State has recognized their power and has started to highlight it increasingly to their international audience. So we're seeing much more propaganda coming out of Africa. It's become a central focus of their propaganda to their worldwide affiliates. Including last year, we saw a editorial in the Islamic State's magazine, I guess, for lack of their propaganda machine, that called specifically for jihad in Africa, for people to come to Africa to wage jihad. So it's become increasingly important to the Islamic State that they highlight these activities. By 2018, the Islamic State had lost its core territories in Iraq and Syria. They've lost most of their money, and they lost their ability to really support most of their dependents and their fighters. And so with that shift, like I said, there's been more of this focus on Africa, and they've had to shift the way that they do things. So they've created these so-called regional offices. We see them in various places around the world within Africa, Nigeria, and Somalia. And these regional offices help to coordinate the financing and the operations within their kind of area of operation for the various affiliates and provinces. To give an example of this, the one that we are focused on, would be the Al-Qarar office in Somalia. So this office is run by IS Somalia. It controls the affiliates in Congo and Mozambique. It controls the provinces in Congo and Mozambique, and is responsible for various affiliates across East, Central, and Southern Africa. And this includes providing them with funding, with direction from IS Central, with various help and training. And this has had a huge effect on the provinces and affiliates' abilities to operate. So in the case of ISCAP, the Central Africa province being controlled by Al-Qarar, pre-2017, when the ADF joined the Islamic State and became ISCAP, at that point, the ADF was at its lowest point in its 25-year history. It was almost extinct. It was down to a few hundred fighters. They didn't have money to support themselves. With joining the Islamic State and with the money that's come from that, the notoriety that's come from that, they're now at their highest ever in terms of fighters. There's been a massive rise in the civilian violence being experienced in Congo because of the Islamic State Central Africa province. They've almost quadrupled their area of operations, and all of this is due to the support from the Islamic State and the very real world consequences that are happening on the ground there. And this meteoric rise is really quintessential of what is happening in Africa and what the consequences, what this threat looks like because of the Islamic State. So with that framing, I would like to introduce our panelists. I'll read a brief bio for you, and then I'll turn it over for the prepared remarks. So first, we will have Dr. Boulama Boucarty. He is the Vice President of Programs and Disarmament, Demobilization, and Reintegration for Bridgeway Foundation. He, for over a decade, Dr. Boucarty has researched violent extremist groups in sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on the Lake Chad region and the Sahel. His works have been published by the Tony Blair Institute, Foreign Policy, the Independent, the Telegraph, CNN. There's a very long list here, Boulama. It's impressive. I'm gonna cut to it and just say he's published a lot of places. Many people trust his opinion very highly. He is also a regular guest on Hausa and English language channels, including Voice of America, BBC, Al Jazeera, and France 24. Before joining Bridgeway, Dr. Boucarty was a senior analyst in the Extremism Policy Unit of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and a dual qualified lawyer in Nigeria and England, Wales. He is currently completing his PhD in law at SOAS University of London. After Boulama speaks, we'll be hearing from Anand Arun, who is a senior intelligence officer for global counterterrorism analysis at the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. In that role, he's the deputy analytic head of DIA's Defense Counterterrorism Center and frequently leads engagements with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Joint Staff, National Security Council, and Congress. Mr. Arun's career spans nearly 2 decades in the private sector, academia, and U.S. government, supporting customers ranging from deployed military personnel to executive officials, including a tour as the President's daily briefer to the chairman and the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During his career, he has led or overseen analysis on some of the most pressing global terrorism issues. Part-time, Mr. Arun is an adjunct assistant professor of security studies at Georgetown University, teaching a graduate course on terrorism and intelligence. He holds an MA in security studies from Georgetown and a BA in political science from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And then our final speaker will be Brigadier General Dominique Twesigomwe, who is the head of the National Counterterrorism Center for the Ugandan People's Defense Forces. He has been serving in the UPDF since 1985. Throughout his storied career, he's participated in various international diplomatic forums as the Ugandan Defense Advisor and formerly served as the director of the Joint Anti-Terrorism Task Force within the UPDF. Brigadier General Twesigomwe holds a BA in Social Sciences from Makerere University and an MA in International Relations and postgraduate diploma, and a postgraduate diploma in Strategic Studies from the University of Nairobi. He has received numerous academic accolades, including a Certificate of Advanced Physical Security from the University of Georgia and a Diploma in Special Operations in Combating Terrorism from the University of Florida. He's also a graduate of the National Defense College and Senior Staff Command College in Karen, Nairobi. So we'll give each panelist 10 minutes to deliver some prepared remarks, and then we'll go into the discussion section. So let's start with you, Bulama.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tara, for your generous introduction. I mean, you wrote the bios and is complaining that a list is long. I mean, I would start by telling you about myself, maybe about my nightmares, because I have many of them today. And the first is that Shannon is here. You know, I'm sure all of you can relate. It's very difficult to speak before your boss. But when you are speaking before your boss's boss, because Lauren is my boss, and then you have his boss here. Yeah, and the second nightmare is Tara's fault, because she didn't tell me I could prepare slides, and I am very good at getting friends to prepare slides. And the trick is that if I don't make sense, the photos in the slides would distract the audience. But unfortunately, I don't have that today. So yeah, we are in for a ride. I thought I would just start with 3 points, and it is just raising them so we can have a conversation on them for the rest of our stay here, but also later. And the first is a point Tara has started speaking to, which is around the nature of the relationship between ISIS and the groups in Africa. Some would call them affiliates, I call them partners. Some would even see them as puppets for ISIS, while others doubt that there is any relationship, real relationship between them and ISIS. And I mean, the evidence is clear that these groups have developed strong ties with ISIS, and I just want to explain the nature of the relationship. As Tara said, all the affiliates or partners in Africa existed before ISIS. So you could say all of them except 2 have existed before ISIS. And the 2 that did not predate ISIS is ISIS in the Greater Sahara or ISIS in the Sahel province, and the ISIS in Somalia. But even them, their parents' group has predated ISIS. And they broke away from that group and then pledged allegiance to ISIS. Why am I saying this? It is so that we understand that these are local groups with local agenda and local grievances. And they are very locally rooted even before, or they were rooted before ISIS came on board. And then ISIS courted them. And I think in that, unfortunately, ISIS understands the importance of local partnership more than many of us. They courted them, they showed them what they can provide, and those groups then agreed to pledge allegiance to ISIS. And what does it provide? The paper talks about funding. Funding is one of it, but there are many more things. And the first thing that comes after affiliation is theological guidance. Theological guidance is very important for most of these groups because they claim to be ideologically driven, especially their leaders. And because many of them claim to be fighting for Islam, but they are ignorant of Islam, and they want to run a state that is, they say, Sharia compliant, but they are ignorant of the Sharia, before ISIS, they would rely on mainstream Muslim scholars. So from the bush, if there was any question on Islamic marriage or anything to do with social transactions in Islam or commercial transactions, they would ring up Muslim Salafi clerics in the towns whom they do not trust. But they can trust them with the theology because they know that the scholars would not change the theology. Now, with pledges to ISIS, ISIS provide that theological guidance, and therefore they don't need to rely on scholars they don't trust anymore because ISIS has scholars, and because they are Arabs, or most of them are Arabs, many of these groups think their version of Islam is correct or their interpretation is better than theirs, and therefore they rely on them for theological guidance. But also for guidance on administration, policy, and operations. And we have seen that in the example of the Islamic State West Africa province, which is the first ISIS province in Africa that pledged allegiance in 2015. And what we saw was ISIS first offering virtual trainings and then later deploying operatives through Libya to Nigeria to the Lake Chad region, and those operatives then fought together with with ISWAP, observing how they fought, and they recommended operational changes and administrative changes to how they run their military. So they provide policy, administrative, and operational guidance. And then media training, because media is maybe 70% of the jihad. If they don't push out things in the media, then it becomes difficult for people even to know it's happening. And the essence of terrorism is to terrorize people. You can't terrorize them if they don't even know what you are doing. And so media training is part of it. And so these are some of the things ISIS offers to them. And of course, they also believe in the ideology that pledging allegiance to the caliph is a religious duty. And we have seen instances of group leaders who do not want to pledge allegiance or did not want to pledge allegiance, but their lieutenants argued that it's a religious duty and therefore they were forced into pledging allegiance. So in essence, the nature of the relationship, you could say, is a partnership in which the groups in Africa benefit from finances, operational training, media training, and stuff like that. And on the part of ISIS, the three main benefits are: number one, ISIS cannot claim to be a global brand as it wants to if it doesn't have affiliates in Africa and elsewhere. And especially with the defeat of the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, then there would be nothing for them to bank on except unless they have affiliates elsewhere. And that's why they started courting groups in Africa. The second is that they feed ISIS's propaganda. I mean, propaganda in the sense that ISIS can use examples of what groups in Africa are doing to show their fighters and their potential recruits so that people will get recruited. And finally, which is related to the second, is that they feed ISIS's media. I mean, if you looked at the claim for last year, for example, most of the claims come from Africa. And ISIS, unfortunately, the magazine Terra was talking about, the An-Naba'a magazine, the weekly magazine ISIS publishes every Thursday, will be empty if African groups don't send them claims of responsibility and if they don't publish those. So that's the nature of the relationship. It's a marriage of convenience, if you like. Now, the second point I wanted to make, and Terra, please let me know if I am overrunning. I used to be teaching in Nigeria. I used to teach in a university in Nigeria. Our lectures last for 2 hours. And it's mostly the all-knowledgeable teacher talking to the all-ignorant students and dictating notes to them. So
You've got 5 minutes still.
okay. So
2 hours.
yeah. The second point is about the state-building activities of ISIS affiliates on the African continent. And Terra has spoken to the fatalities. Thousands of people every year die. And if we are lucky, that gets into the media. That gets media headlines when we are lucky. But what doesn't get media headline is their hearts and minds approach, their state-building activities on the ground, which targets communities, and in some cases they succeed by winning over local populations to believe that these are not our enemies. They are enemies of the corrupt governments that are propped by secular Western partners. And so in the Lake Chad region, we know that ISWAP is controlling a large area of land where they have built an economy with fishermen, with herders who herd their animal and pay taxes to them, and with huge farms where they cultivate their food and other needs. In the Sahel affiliate, that's the Islamic State Sahel province, also controls an area of land where they provide basic government functions, including adjudication services, courts, if you like, their own kinds of courts. In the Lake Chad region, they even provide hospitals, basic hospitals. They build latrines, they build water sources to show their local affiliates their prototype state, ideologically driven prototype states. Now, we are starting to see the same thing in Mozambique, because the group in Mozambique used to target civilians, but over the past few months, the evidence is becoming clear that they have stopped targeting civilians, and what they are rather trying to do is to adopt this heart and minds approach to win over local populations and recruit them into the cause. We haven't started seeing that in the Congo yet. Maybe they would transition to that, but maybe not. Maybe the Islamic State in the Congo would continue as it is, and their modus operandi is attacking everyone that does not join the group. And if that's what they would continue with, then the challenge is for us to develop a policy to look at, to tackle or to address both of the different approaches. Now, like I said, that's succeeding, unfortunately, on the ground because in the areas where they operate, governments are very weak. Social services are non-existent. Infrastructure is non-existent, and therefore people are starting to see them as the government. And if you hear some communities, the way they praise them and tell them they don't attack us, they even protect us from attacks, they are not corrupt like the police, blah, blah, blah. That's a worry for me. It may not be a worry in the short term because you don't see it in media headlines, fatalities. There may not be fatalities from that approach, but in the long run, it's going to be a very, very difficult issue for us to deal with. Finally, the supply routes. For each of these groups, they are sitting strategically in border regions, whether in the Lake Chad, in the Sahel, in Congo, or in Mozambique, and they choose that deliberately because they want to ensure that their supply routes continue to flow. Fighters, finances, food, fuel, and other supplies. And unfortunately, we haven't done enough to cut the supply routes. And fighting the groups while their supply routes continue to flow is like when your bath overflows and then you get a cup and start scooping the water without stopping the tap. The tap continues to run and you continue to evacuate the water, to scoop the water. I don't think you are getting anywhere. And so I think it is important for us to look at how to stop finances, fighters, supplies, including drugs, from flowing into those groups. And perhaps part of it is taking border security more seriously, but also taking transnational intelligence and security cooperation amongst African countries more seriously. Thank you very much. We can go into any of these or any other issues you might have in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Bulama. We'll pass it over to Hanum.
All right, so good afternoon. Thank you to George Washington University and to the Bridgeway Foundation for the invitation. Unfortunately or fortunately, DIA does not get a lot of these invitations, so I'm really happy to be up here today with you. We do want to speak to the public from time to time and kind of give our view as well. So we at DIA have been fortunate for the last 20 plus years that we have so many dedicated, passionate, articulate, intelligent kind of officers on ISIS particularly, but also in particular on Africa. And even amid the US government's pivot, so to speak, towards great power competition, as kind of Laren mentioned at the beginning, DIA is committed to identifying, analyzing, and mitigating the threat from terrorist groups, helping the Department of Defense do that, helping our broader US government do that, helping our local partners and allies do that. So I just want to acknowledge the tireless work that DIA has been doing on this issue, and really I'm here representing the work of those officers, particularly the ones focused on Africa here today. So my remarks are going to be somewhat related to what you had spoken about, Tara, and even Dr. Bacardi here, but from a slightly different angle. So when I think about the threat from ISIS in Africa, I think about it first in the broader context of the threat globally from ISIS and where we've come in the past decade, roughly, starting when ISIS self-declared a caliphate under false and kind of twisted pretenses back in 2014. So as was mentioned, the group immediately tried to portray this picture of expansion. So not only were they holding territory in Iraq and Syria, but immediately they started to make it seem like they were ever expanding. They named new provinces across the Middle East, eventually into South Asia, parts of North Africa. But as was mentioned, a lot of these provinces, so to speak, were existing groups that had long existed in the regions before, or they were defectors from Al-Qaeda, and many of them were not particularly operationally capable. In Algeria, for example, they named a province, and they boast that province boasted no more than a few dozen fighters, even at its height. So that's just one kind of thing to keep in mind, that ISIS is trying to make it seem like they're bigger than they are. And there's, of course, a lot of concern, and rightfully so, in particular areas. But for DI, we want to put that in a kind of broader context, that some of this is kind of the media side of things. There's also considerable debate in the policy community, in the intelligence community, in the academic community at the beginning in 2014 as to how ISIS were these groups, right? So as I mentioned, they were already existent, and the idea that somehow ISIS would be able to influence them and change them in a way that suited their own needs was hotly debated. And so the question became, how much does ISIS in Iraq and Syria really care about what's happening in Algeria or Afghanistan or wherever across the world? And I was the DIA senior analyst for counterterrorism in the Middle East, and so I looked at kind of the core leadership in 2014, but I looked at it from both the local and global perspective. And at the time, the US government really went into crisis mode and formed that broader coalition of partners to go after the ISIS threat globally. But that coalition was largely made up, at least initially, of Western countries and Middle East countries. And we that coalition really went after the core leadership in Iraq and Syria first and foremost, although there were some efforts across the Middle East and parts of Africa, particularly North Africa. If you recall, back in that time frame, ISIS's branch in Libya and then in the Sinai were considered some of the biggest threats from the global branches. And now, thankfully, we don't particularly hear about those groups. So we began to really focus the CT efforts against that core group. And by 2016, 2017, we had turned the corner and kind of rolled back a lot of the territory and operational capabilities of ISIS core in Iraq and Syria, and some of the key branches, like I said, in Libya and Egypt. It was at this time, as Terry kind of mentioned up front, that we started to see a shift in ISIS's strategy, and they began to kind of lower the threshold for inclusion into their organization. They began announcing more and more provinces around the world, again, to portray themselves as resilient and powerful, even though they were taking heavy losses in their core. And at the time, again, it made for really good propaganda because the losses kept coming in the seat of the caliphate, and the group kept losing territory, personnel, and resources there, but they could point to some wins in other parts of the globe, in particular Africa. So after this peak of ISIS's operational strength, the threat globally in the 2017 to 2009 time frame, roughly, we started to see those new provinces being announced in Africa, such as in the DRC. We saw the attack by ISIS in Niger against US forces, and we saw ISIS core really double down on the idea that Africa was kind of the central node for the group globally, And they really started to emphasize Africa in their media as proof of the group's resilience and relevance amid the setbacks they were facing elsewhere. So from 2018 till now, we've seen at least 4 new publicly recognized provinces in Africa. So we're up to 9. There were 5 back in 2018. So we really have to keep this context in mind when we're thinking about understanding the threat and the threat trajectory. The threat from ISIS really started to multiply and expand, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in part because of the global CT pressure that was focused elsewhere, particularly in the Middle East, parts of North Africa, and South Asia. So that was one factor. And then the other factor was, again, the media emphasis and the ISIS core emphasis on where we can portray ourselves as having some operational success. And that's when we really started to see this threat really metastasize. So when we think about this growing threat from ISIS in Africa and how it's now comparatively lower in other parts of the world, I just want that to be clear, because sometimes we, as a U.S. government, as a community of experts on CT, tend to paint ISIS as almost invincible and 10 feet tall. But in reality, part of the reason that threat has really grown in Africa is because we have focused elsewhere. So we need to really focus on the threat in Africa and getting it to a manageable point. And if there is a unified and persistent effort, the group, I think, the group's threat can be mitigated and get into a more, again, manageable threat that local security services can better handle. One of the other critical drivers of the upward trajectory of ISIS, besides that kind of relative lack of counterterrorism pressure, unified counterterrorism pressure that was focused elsewhere, was that we also started to see, and Tara mentioned this as well, ISIS set up a new global command structure. So in order to truly capitalize on the momentum that global branches were having while they were under siege in Iraq and Syria, ISIS established the global director of provinces, and then underneath that central body were these regional offices with representatives of ISIS core that were providing a direct line in the regions back up to the core leadership in Iraq and Syria. They set up these regional offices in multiple parts of Africa and around the world, really, to provide ISIS with the guidance, to provide the affiliates with the guidance, the TTPs, the fundraising, the sharing, pooling of knowledge and kind of resources that has really enabled a lot of these groups to rapidly gain capability. So even though initially some of these groups were just changing labels or rebranding, eventually those resources, that guidance, that theological guidance, has kind of inculcated within a lot of these branches. Many of the senior leaders in particular of these ISIS global branches have bought in to the ideology, and they do often take orders or adjust tactics or strategy in response to ISIS core in Iraq and Syria. They also attempt to implement what they portray as Islamic law in accordance with, of course, ISIS's very twisted interpretation of it. So again, the structural changes were an important development in the upward trajectory of ISIS branches in Africa that really changed and made these groups more of that ISIS flavor to them. The other effect of ISIS's centralization of leadership and that change in structure was it also enabled this interconnectivity across Africa that would have been very difficult to otherwise establish. So, of course, Africa is a vast, very diverse land. Establishing and maintaining ISIS connections from west to east Africa and from north to south Africa was not easy. And in this respect, the Al-Qarar office and other offices like that were a key focal point under some key ISIS facilitators, such as Bilal Sudani, who is now deceased, and they were kind of instrumental in improving the connectivity across the various ISIS branches in Africa. But I think, I just mentioned the Bilal Sudani death. it's important, even amid all of the focus on state actors, I think the United States really sent another strong message to all ISIS fighters that we are still very much committed to going to the ends of the earth. And we made this point time and time again, no matter where in the world ISIS tries to hide, how safe they think they are, there is nowhere that is safe. So the United States and its allies and partners have the capability to go after ISIS anywhere in the world. And as long as we're committed to that, there is no safe haven for these groups. So why has the U.S. And kind of the coalition largely focused on the Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa? I would argue that is because those were the regions of the world where we saw the greatest threat to the United States homeland and to our U.S. facilities and personnel. And in most cases, the trajectory for ISIS and the capabilities of ISIS in those parts of the world now has been blunted or reversed. So today, we're seeing ISIS's local and regional attack capabilities in Africa increase, particularly in the Sahel and West Africa and parts of Central Africa. And I think now you're starting to see that growing momentum by the United States and other international community members to partner with, with African leaders and really take on this problem. So to sum up, when I think about the evolution of ISIS in Africa, I really break it into first and foremost the threat in North Africa and then Sub-Saharan Africa. But then I also think about these three major factors: the global counterterrorism pressure and where we have focused it up till now, ISIS's global propaganda, how they tried to tout success at a time when they were getting rolled back elsewhere. And third, I think about the structural changes that were meant to more aggressively capitalize on what was going on globally once the group realized that Africa was really the main place that they can point to any continued success. So in the context of how we got here, where are we going now? I think there are 5 things that I would say that if left unchecked, we could see in the coming years. First is further territorial expansion, or expansion of at least the operational reach of these groups. We're already seeing ISIS groups start to expand into new parts of the continent, and that is one of their main objectives. They started as localized militant groups with local aims, but over time they've essentially drank more of that ISIS Kool-Aid. They are expanding their influence and operational reach across the regions, ultimately to serve ISIS's purpose of building this pan-Islamic caliphate. Second, we could see more sophisticated attack capabilities emerge. So as groups gain resources, including territory, they're able to launch more sophisticated attacks, and then they're sharing those tactics and techniques and procedures with other ISIS branches. We've also seen, for example, ISIS groups use drones for surveillance and propaganda. And I think the trajectory of this is essentially that they'll be able to arm those drones here in the coming years. Third, I think we could see ISIS groups look to continue to conduct more kidnapping for ransom, particularly of Westerners, following the lead of al-Qaeda groups like Jainim. These groups are aware that holding Westerners can be lucrative and lead to multi-million-dollar ransom payments, which would be a huge boost for groups in Africa and fund further operations for years. Fourth, I think we could see changes in the local and the regional intent of these groups. So as these groups gain territory, other resources, hone their capabilities, we at DIA are closely watching any attempt by these groups to target U.S. facilities, U.S. personnel, U.S. forces on the ground, U.S. economic interests, so on and so forth. And then fifth, changes in global intent. Although these groups, again, are locally and regionally focused, focus does not mean that we couldn't see other things emerge. So over the last 2 decades, we've seen a lot of instances that have taught us that groups can change their kind of transnational global intent very rapidly, seemingly overnight. So a couple examples: Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Yemen, locally focused, and then all of a sudden in 2009 goes global, tries to hit the United States on Christmas Day of 2009. ISIS itself, the core leadership in Iraq and Syria, very locally focused until it solidified power in 2014 began kind of reaping the benefits of all the resources that they were gaining, and then they began to expand. So there are a number of factors that can drastically expand the group's intent, and that is one of the main reasons that the counterterrorism fight is not over for the United States, even though we need to rebalance and we ensure that we're covering a whole host of other threats. So our challenge at DIA is that we're going to continue to identify those threats, whether they be locally, regionally, or trans-regionally, and help the Department of Defense, as well as our allies and partners on the ground, mitigate those threats. And DI is committed to doing that, the Department of Defense is committed to doing that, the US government is committed to doing that. So again, no matter where in the world ISIS thinks it can survive or even thrive, the US and its partners and allies will ultimately find ways to disabuse them of that notion. This threat can be managed, but it requires a broad coalition that is committed for the long haul and persistent and kind of focused effort, and particularly here in the Africa part of the world. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. General?
Thank you. Thank you. I must start by acknowledging the big role played by the Bridgeway Foundation for having given me this latitude of sharing a few moments with you here in regard to the threat of IS in Africa, Uganda in particular, and furthermore to thank Bridgeway Foundation for assisting the defectors of ADF, Allied Democratic Front, to defect and by providing the programs to protect the beacons of hope in this conflict region, hence bridging the gap. I thank you. I will start by introducing myself. I come from Uganda, as you've heard, and Uganda has had a turbulent past. First of all, ranging from those days when we had the terrorism by the Lordly Resistance Army under the 10 Commandments of God, which we were following, but now to Allied Democratic Front, who are extremists and posing a great threat to Uganda in particular and to DRC, which is our neighbor in the West. Maybe I'll start with giving us a brief origin of the Allied Democratic Front, which was brought by some of the young men who went for training in Pakistan. And as they came with a wrong interpretation, violent interpretation of Islamic religion, which misguided the Muslim community, hence creating conflicts within the community, whereby there was the development of others who called themselves more radicals. These are the Tablighs. There was a conflict, they fought. Some of them were, as per the law established, they were arrested, imprisoned, later on released, and thereafter they had to flee the country to the eastern DRC. And that's how they started. When they got there, of course, they started their fundamentalist policies of trying to create confusion here and there. And with this distorted and misguided interpretation of the Islamic religion, of course, it was a mixture of joining with some other rebel group, the NALU, which had its political interests from DRC. They attacked Uganda. They were repulsed. But then, as time went along, they started developing, causing terrorist activities, both in the urban centers and in rural areas. That's why we refer to ADF as a rural and urban terrorist organization. And no doubt that its leader, Jamil Mukuru, was one of those founder members who had been trained by that time in Pakistan. And that's how he developed to become the leader. But then, of course, later on, as pressure, military pressure mounted on them, both in the country and in Eastern DRC, one of their leaders called Jamil Mkuru had to flee the country to Dar es Salaam, to Tanzania. And later on, he was repatriated. But then there was his immediate commander, Baruku, who took over the command and the control of the Allied Democratic Forces. And of course, originally he held several posts, like the chief judge of that terrorist organization and a political commissar, and in charge of the ideological teachings. So this is the Baruku now who pledges allegiance to ISIS. And of course, that was his intention to establish an Islamic State inside DRC as part of the global caliphate. Of course, you realize that even before his boss, Jamil Mkuru, fled from DRC to Tanzania, they had different angles at which they were looking at their organization. And that conflict, of course, continued, and most of the group had to be forced to be with this radical one, the Baruku, who pledged allegiance to ISIS. And of course, no sooner had he done that than ISIS started claiming responsibility of attacks in Beni. That was in 2019, and calling themselves now named Central African Province, ISCAP. And of course, it started claiming several of the attacks, and of course, distributing hostile graphic contents to its terrorist campaigns in social medias throughout the whole of region. And of course, started massive recruitment to establish the presence and of even foreign fighters within rebel ranks. And it's now some of these foreign fighters that are now changing the dynamic of the operational modalities, like introduction now of the drone program, which they will be using. And to us, this is a very big shift in the mode of operandus, especially where the technologies are at play, and we are seeing it as a big threat. We are also seeing that this ISCAP in Central Africa Republic has developed some financial links, and part of the neighboring countries like Kenya appears to be the financial hub, and Tanzania and Burundi still play an ever-increasing role in the recruitment, contributing to the largest source of non-foreign fighters. And it's important to note that this ISCAP in DRC is composed mainly of Ugandans, young women and children who are forcefully recruited. But then, of course, having spent more than 20 years in DRC, Eastern DRC, mainly the region of Beni and Bunia and Butembo and the rest, or which are in Eastern DRC, of course, they had to forcefully recruit some of the population in DRC where they operate. And we are also seeing that some of the financial resources come from South Africa and London, where the financiers have transferred funds to this group. Of course, they have linkages with the ISCAP, with the IS in Mozambique. And we are aware that most Ugandans, or even Kenyans and Burundi, people from Burundi and Rwanda, continue to join the IS in Mozambique through the borders and gazetted entry points. And of course, we are aware that they are in touch and closely linked with Al-Shabaab in Somalia. And of course, this Al-Shabaab in Somalia normally conduct retaliatory attacks because of Uganda's participation in the Africa transition mission in Somalia. I'm sure you heard that last week ATMIS forces in Somalia were attacked by the Al-Shabaab, and we lost about 54 soldiers, UPDF soldiers serving in ATMIS. But nonetheless, the struggle continues with these IS, their collaborators of Al-Shabaab, and those accomplices, those affiliates in Mozambique. But it's important to note here that given the DRC's geographical position in Africa, its porous borders, general instability, and governed empty spaces are increasingly becoming attractive as a location for these foreign fighters from Africa and beyond who are participating in the ISCAP ADF operations, where millions have been killed, millions of Ugandans, millions of our neighboring Congolese population have been killed, property destroyed, displacement, and all the like. In my view, I think the ADF ISCAP links with ISS should indeed be taken seriously, and more especially that they continue to collaborate in carrying out bombing attacks within Kampala city. An example of the recent 2010 bombings where several people have died. They haven't stopped at that. They have continued with their assassinations. Last year, they assassinated some senior police commanders. A senior prosecutor was murdered, and some other ADF commanders who had initially converted and integrated into the Uganda People's Defense Forces, and even some clerics, Muslim clerics, were murdered. And these people have claimed, the IS has claimed responsibility. Although there is no doubt that IS has taken root in Uganda, and the IS ISCAP in DRC are now having a similar flag like the IS, and therefore this threat posed by the IS in Africa should therefore be considered as a priority, but not as just as a slideshow of activities of those remnants in Syria and Iraq. We believe that it's not just fighting a low-grade insurgency on the continent, because this IS continues to turn some places in DRC as human slaughterhouses. There is an area which has been named the Triangle of Death recently, one of its former stronger strongholds, where they have been moved out as a result of the recent and ongoing Operation Suja, codenamed, which is being done jointly with the Uganda government and the DRC government. And of course, I can't enumerate more of the horrendous acts committed by this group. There are very many, and we are aware that in 2017, this group conducted one of its deadliest attacks on the UN peacekeepers of Tanzania, soldiers, and wounding dozens. And of course, in 2009, they again claimed responsibility for having attacked UN peacekeepers, the MONUSCO. And of course, now recently in 2021, claiming simultaneous bombing attacks in Kampala city and smaller other bombings. where civilians have been killed. I wish to say this, that indeed ISIS presents an existential threat to Africa in general, but to Uganda and DRC in particular, where it has taken root and now increasing impact across the world. It is likely to continue threatening the security of the interests of both countries and, of course, the interests of the international actors. We are seeing that the IS trainers are based in Somalia, in Kenya, and Mozambique, and they continue to assist the ISCAP in DRC, in training, ideological guidance, operational planning, communication, and to develop further capabilities of suicide bombings. And so, as I conclude, I think this ISCAP is symptomatic of a much broader set of developments that we need to understand. And I think the conventional wisdom on security needs an urgent rethink. It's an indicative of a growing threat for which traditional military responses are simply not fit for response. And it's therefore riddled with asymmetric and hybrid warfare. And in spite of the several policy instruments used by the government, it remains evasive, and I hope we shall share more of the policy responses in our further session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all three of our panelists. That was a very interesting background and details that you gave us. I have just a couple of questions, and then I do want to open it up to the audience. We have about a half an hour to discuss. So I'll start out with asking each of you, where do you think you've outlined kind of what the existing threat is across Africa? Where do you see the next threat coming from? Is it a new territory? Is it a new tactic? What do you think is going to be the next threat that we should be looking forward to and trying to anticipate from the Islamic State? Maybe we'll just go down the line for any of you that want to respond. We'll start with Bulama.
Sure. I think Anwar mentioned, I would have said more sophisticated use of technology, because what we are seeing, for example, from the Islamic State West Africa province is trialing with drones. They started quite a few years ago, but it was mostly small commercial drones. They started using them for photos, for surveillance now, and there is growing evidence that they are now trialing how to start arming those drones. And I think if that happened, then we are going to see, unfortunately, more deadlier attacks, especially on security and government targets, because that's where the group targets, but also on Christian minority communities in northern Nigeria. ISWAP has this policy, and we are starting to see the same kind of policy in the Sahel. They don't attack Muslim communities. But they focus attacks on government, security forces, and Christian communities. And because these communities are minority, they are unheard. And unfortunately, politicians in Africa, but also across the world, don't pay attention to things that don't make the headlines. So we might continue to see more sophisticated use of technology, but also continued expansion. The Islamic State Sahel province, for example, over the past 2 years, has expanded attacks to 3 different countries, to Benin, Togo, and Burkina Faso. And there has been this worry of threat to coastal West Africa. We are seeing growing threats to Ghana, or growing worries in Ghana. The ADF, that's the Islamic State Central Africa, the Islamic State in the DRC, expanded its attacks to places like, of course, we saw the bombing in Kampala, we saw the attempted bombing in Rwanda, and we are seeing some activity in Tanzania. And they may be able to establish cells in countries outside of Uganda and Congo, and then you might start to see more fighters into those cells, and perhaps new provinces might be established, or at least the threat would continue to expand. Just as we saw in Nigeria, in addition to the Lake Chad region, over the past 2 years, we saw the Islamic State West Africa province claiming attacks in states they had never attacked before. Places like Kogi State in north-central Nigeria, like Osun State in southwestern Nigeria, like the Sokoto State in northwestern Nigeria, which was actually attacked by the Islamic State in the Sahel province. So expansion of attacks, expansion of state-building activities, but also use of technology, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I spoke to some of the things that I thought we could see next in my kind of prepared remarks, but I would want to reinforce that technological change factor. I think because we're so steeped in it all the time, we don't see how rapidly and exponentially technology is changing, and it has changed even in the last decade or two. People tell me, oh, well, the internet penetration is not as good in Africa. But, if Bilal al-Sudani can access the internet from a cave in the Puntland of Somalia, I think they can figure it out. And I think there's a lot of ways that they can harness what's coming with AI and drones and other things using these technologies. So I'm very much concerned about that and kind of the trajectory, the exponential trajectory of what will be available to the world and to terrorists included. So, but my larger concern is really, we can anticipate several different things, right? But my larger concern is just that, what are we going to miss, right? So, unfortunately, as the United States, some of our European allies, have withdrawn or reduced our presence in Africa, we can unfortunately lose some of our insight into what's going on. So we have to rely much more on our allies and partners to share information, share intelligence, provide that intelligence to the right people, and only then can we really understand what that next threat is and when it's coming, provide that warning so that we can disrupt it. So that's really the catch-22 of counterterrorism. Sometimes the criticism is, the United States is staying in a country for too long, we're present, and therefore that is what is making us a target. But then when we leave, we also kind of lose our ability to kind of see what's going on and prevent and disrupt those coming threats and threats that we may not have anticipated. I think overall, though, terrorists have this inherent vulnerability, and that is their need to communicate. So you can't run any effective organization, whether it's a terrorist group or a business or a foundation, if you do not have effective communication. And as long as that's the case, we will have opportunities to kind of gain insight into what these groups are up to, and we'll continue to rely on our allies and partners to help us with that as well, so that we can anticipate those unanticipated threats.
Thank you. I think I don't digress much from what my counterparts have said. Indeed, the new technologies is where there is a change in tactics. And as I have already mentioned, we are seeing that some of these foreign fighters, like one Jordanian who has been in ADF ranks, has been running the drone program. And of course, without forgetting some online recruitment, we are seeing this is where the new threat is coming from, more especially that they are targeting the youth. And we've seen most of them who've been recruited online joining the IS in Mozambique.
Thank you. One other question, then I'll open it up. So one of the things that was mentioned briefly as well, and that we've seen particularly in our research for ISCAP for DRC, is some of these lateral ties. specifically among top leadership, Musa Buluku, Mehdi and Kalabu, Buluku is the emir of the Central Africa province. Mehdi and Kalabu is the external coordinator / financial emir. He wears many different hats. That there seems to be very direct coordination between them and IS Somalia. There's some indication that there might be coordination between them and IS Mozambique, between the various affiliates. So I'd love to hear your General, you've spoken to this a little bit, but to dig a little deeper into that in terms of the threat of the connection across Africa, these lateral ties, and what that means in terms of how effective these groups can be and what we would need to do to actually fight them. So we can start. Well, I guess General, maybe this is something you've addressed briefly, but we can start with you and then go down that side.
Of course, there are these lateral ties between these groups in DRC and in Mozambique and Al-Shabaab. Of course, both of them are funded by IS Central Command, which is believed to be based in Somalia. And they use the same propaganda, and both hold territories. Though IS in DRC is weaker than the IS in Mozambique, and both of them have strong ties with the Central Command, but we should note that they operate autonomously. And ISCAP DRC is limited to the eastern parts of DRC. But where it continues to fund itself from the illegal main roads within DRC. But they appear separate, all those groups, but they are not separated. They have strong ties, like I've said, in terms of sharing intelligence, recruitment, and they follow the same ideological trends.
Yeah, so I spoke to this a little bit earlier, but I think the regional office structure really has done a lot to bolster that cross-affiliate connectivity. And, you know, it's interesting to see how much they are pooling resources, as this report also aptly kind of notes. They're pooling resources, they're sharing TTPs, they're sharing guidance, and really the structure has been key to that, because oftentimes I think of it as, you know, if I don't have a boss nagging about something every day for me to do, like sometimes I'm just going to focus on whatever it is I'm self-interested in, right? So you need that kind of oversight to say, okay, why don't you also think more beyond what your area of operation is? Share, sometimes it's a parent, right? Almost like talking to their children, share resources, share share advice, share everything, and that's what we've seen ISIS do globally to a pretty remarkable effect, and especially when you compare it to Al-Qaeda. I know this conference is not focused on Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda does not really do that very well. So I think that structure has been a key enabler, and I think you really have to go after those critical nodes in the regional offices, as well as the core leadership. So again, the core leadership is driving a lot of these efforts to share, and absent that, over time, I think you might see a kind of return back to I need to do what I need to do, and boss, you're kind of nagging, and now you're gone, so I don't have to worry about you as much anymore. So going after those critical nodes in the regional offices, and then we've done a lot to also kind of loosen or weaken the ties between the core and those regional offices. I think that's going to have an effect as well going down the line.
Bulama?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with the comments made. If we looked at the Lake Chad region and the Sahel, for example, when Abul Walid al-Sahrawi, the first leader of the Islamic State in Greater Sahara, that was its name, pledged allegiance in 2016, his group was placed under the Islamic State West Africa province, which is active in Nigeria in the Lake Chad region. And what we saw was real-time communication between the groups, before attacks, during attacks, and after attacks. And that mainly takes place through encrypted social media apps, mainly Telegram. And I mean, to the question of internet, you need internet to do that. And we can say internet connection is weak in many places of Africa, but they don't rely on that internet connection. They buy through internet. For example, ISWAP spends like $6,000 on internet per month. So they have enhanced internet that other Nigerians cannot access. And that's what they use then to do those communications. We also saw conference calls, sometimes conference calls between ISIS Central and African groups, but also amongst African groups. They also share intelligence, information, best practices. They share training materials. So for example, if one affiliate looted a particular weapon they don't know how to operate, they just would take a photo of it, put it in the group, and then someone would send them instructions, would send them a YouTube link with instructions on how to operate it. And so there was this real-time communication, and it still continues even after the Islamic State in Greater Sahara has now been declared independent. It's now the Islamic State Sahel province from March last year, but we still continue to see that communication. What I am still interested in, and I'm investigating, is to see whether there is cross-sub-regional communication between ISIS in West Africa, and for example, and those in East Africa or elsewhere. We haven't seen that, but you do see these sub-regional connections.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left. I'll go ahead and open it up. I've got many questions, but we'll give the audience a chance. There are people who will be coming around with the microphone so that it can get picked up for everyone and on the feed. But if you have a question, please just raise your hand and we'll get started. Someone and then lots of people. Okay. So maybe we take 2 questions. You're welcome to address it to a single person, to the entire panel. Let's take 2 questions, and then it looks like we have quite a few, so I'll just ask you to keep your answers as brief as possible. So let's start with these 2 here.
Thank you. Thanks for your expertise, and Sanu Daiki. The question I have for you, in West Africa, do you believe that the Fula, the Fulani, the Fulbe, and/or security forces, rogue security forces, are working with ISWAP and these different ISIS groups?
And we'll take a second question as well.
Hi, thank you, and thank you to Bridgeway and to GW for this excellent conference, and to our panelists. 2 quick questions. The first one is, in addition to kidnapping and resources from ISIS, what are the other economic activities that these groups are using to fund themselves? And the second question is, what are China and Russia's responses to these groups, since they both have a significant presence on the ground?
Great. Okay, why don't we start with those, and then we'll go over, there's a group of questions over here as well. So Bulama, we can start with you with the specific question, then we'll open it up for the other 2.
No, fantastic questions, and they would require another workshop, I would think. Sanuda Aiki in Hausa means well done job, so thank you is Nagodi. Now, on the question of Fulani groups, whether they are working with ISWAP, rogue security forces, I mean, what we have seen is an attempt, a significant attempt by the Al-Qaeda affiliate, rather than ISWAP, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Nigeria called Ansarul Muslimina fi Biladi Sudan, which is based in northwestern and north central Nigeria. They are the one actively trying to recruit the Fulani ethnic group. And they are succeeding to some extent, but that's very dangerous because many members of Jenim are also Fulani, but also the Islamic State in the Sahel. And so one thing that we might see in terms of the threat, unless something is done about it, is this road bridge between the crisis in the Sahel and what we see in northwestern Nigeria. especially if they succeed in recruiting significant number of Fulanis. But for ISWAP, most of ISWAP fighters are Kanuri. I am Kanuri myself, unfortunately, but most of the members, maybe 90% or so, are Kanuri, and that's their target group. In fact, part of the reason for the factionalization in Boko Haram, because all of these groups were Boko Haram, but they factionalized, part of it is ethnic, and it is because the Hausa Fulanis feel the Kanuri leadership of Boko Haram, the original Boko Haram, doesn't involve them. That's partly the reason. So Fulanis are mostly the target of Ansaru rather than ISWAP. But ISWAP is targeting the Ibra ethnic group in north-central Nigeria, and that's the ethnic group they have used now to set up a cell in Kogi State and some cell that is beginning to appear in Osun State. The Ibra ethnic group and Igala are related to the Yorubas, and so we might see recruitment from the Yoruba ethnic group, and in the coming months or years, if they succeeded with the Ibra target. Now, on the question of where financing comes, in addition to this, most of the resources, especially for ISWAP, are internal resources. And one thing is exploitation of natural resources in the Lake Chad region. Fishing is a big thing for them. They fish and sell the fish, but also they give fishermen access to the lake, and then they pay them taxes. And that was unfortunately exacerbated by government policy, because government policy in the Lake Chad region 2 years or so ago was that Boko Haram fishes in the lake, and therefore they completely ban fishing. But there are hundreds or thousands of people who rely on fishing. They have been fishermen forever. And so the only person that grants them access to the lake was Boko Haram, was ISWAP, and therefore they had no option but to collaborate with them. They also rustle cows. Thousands of herds of cows have been rustled, and that's then sold elsewhere, and that's a big source of income. But most importantly, they have very big farms where they cultivate food. You could say they are almost self-sufficient when it comes to food. Of course, they would require oil, salt, and others from outside the territory, but they have big farms that were mostly abandoned by the 3 million people that were displaced. But also taxation, and that applies to the Sahel as well, where you see zakat being collected by them and extortion from people who are rich, who cannot be protected by government. They get threatened that if they don't make a particular amount of contribution monthly, they would get targeted. So these are some of the sources of income. There are theories around drugs. I don't see any evidence for that. In fact, dealing in drugs is punishable with death in the caliphate, and I don't see but then you see theories like that in some literature.
Thank you. Just in the interest of time, I feel like that was a pretty comprehensive response on the resources question, so maybe we'll go to the question in terms of Russia and China. I don't know if one of our other panelists would like to address that.
That's outside of my area of expertise, so I'll defer to
In general, do you have any? Anyone want to?
Actually, I published a paper on Russia in Africa at the Tony Blair Institute. It was last year. China doesn't have a big role, but Russia does. And part of what we don't acknowledge, and it is unfortunately exacerbating the problem, is that from the learnings in Iraq and Syria, and with territories like Boko Haram, ISWAP and ISIS affiliates have understood that holding a big territory and administering it is Herculean. They cannot do that. So their intent right now is to create enough instability to make countries ungovernable for governments. And they have succeeded in doing that in the Sahel. When we saw the military coup in Mali, in Burkina Faso, each of them cited insecurity or the failure of the democratically elected governments to tackle ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates on the ground. And we saw populations celebrating because they also saw their governments failing. And then we saw Al-Qaeda and ISIS groups taking those clips and showing that they have succeeded, because it was their demand for governments to not be democratic, and then for the French to go, and the French are gone now. And then we have Wagner. for example, in Mali, there are around 800 Wagner troops, the Russian military contractors, and the Malian government pays them around $10 million per month. But we know that Russia does not have the political will, neither does it have the capacity right now to help African governments tackle insecurity. And because the US is receding, because the West is receding, and Russia saying, we are the partners, we have succeeded in Syria, and we have propped Bashar al-Assad, African governments are moving to them, and we might continue to see bigger roles for Russia in disinformation, malign campaign, spread of conspiracy theories. When we see, for example, anti-French protests in the Sahel, many of it is down to social media conspiracies that are spread by Russian agents. And I think the West has got to do more in that. Visits are important, but I think we need to, the US needs to bolster its relationship with African countries. If you talk to any African leader, especially from the countries we have spoken about, their key priority is insecurity. And they will partner with any country that has proven that it can fight insecurity. Unfortunately, Russia is making lots of efforts, not just there, but Central African Republic, Sudan. I mean, many countries in Africa are turning to Russia. Russia is now supplying a third of Africa's arms, on the continent, and so it's becoming a big actor. I mean, China's role is mostly in infrastructure, especially telecommunication.
Thank you. Okay, let's take a question here, and then we've got 2 questions back there. Let's take all 3, and then that will be wrapping it up. So 2 questions back there and a question here at the front.
Hi, thank you. My question goes to the brigadier from Uganda. Isn't it time for Uganda to pull out from the anti-terrorism coalition? Because I don't think we have yielded. I'll give 2 examples. One, for Congo, we are paying reparations in the amount of $325 million for plundering in the Congo while we went there to fight ADF. The African Gold Refinery has also been sanctioned by the Treasury Department due to getting illegal gold from Congo. So in our way of fighting Congo, isn't there any other ways we can support the Democratic Republic of Congo than having boots on ground? Now, for Somalia, in 2020, in the run-up to the 2021 elections, President Museveni brought boots on the ground from Somalia to Uganda, and more than 100 people, although the magic number 54 was given, that they were killed on the streets. Those were innocent civilians that were killed by UPDF soldiers that had been brought back from Somalia. And then in 2021, Uganda runs a false story in the news that they had killed 189 Al-Shabaab militants. Was that a stunt? What was the motivation for running that news? Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a woman back here, and then we'll go up here. So if you could bring the...
Thank you very much for your presentation, especially the aspect you raised around leveraging how ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups are actually leveraging local grievances and local realities to further their recruitment, of which obviously the absence of the central state is very important. I have 2 questions. One, talking about the some of the new tactics we've seen, including how cities, villages have been blocked off in Jibo, Arbinda, etc. How do you see that tactic? Does it fit within this a different way of either collectively punishing communities, or is it a way of disrupting, obviously, states' activities? So that's the first question. The second question is on Congo and ADF. I'm just going to build on the moderator's questions around lateral interactions. Do you see, obviously, all these groups need a certain social and political environment to sustain themselves. And West Africa and Congo are kind of different in the sense that in Congo, you will have a plurality of groups some ideologically inclined and others which are not. Do we see lateral interactions between local defense groups, militia groups, groups like the Mai Mais, and the ADF? And if so, what is our collective response to that? Thank you.
Okay, final question up here, and then we'll answer all of them quickly as we're running out of time, please.
So my name is William. I am the CEO of Black Men Network. I'm also the chairman of Intelligence Working Together. I just want to piggyback a little bit on the question about China and Russia's involvement in stopping ISIS. It's been our standing theory that Russia and China have no interest in stopping ISIS in Africa. Why? Because China and Russia want to increase their foothold in Africa. And the easiest way to do that is to destabilize the government. And how do you destabilize a government that essentially what you do is you institute the wild dog theory. If there's a dog that's out of control, you bring in a dog that you can control to take control of the wild dog. And that's what they're doing with ISIS, right? In theory, that's what they're doing with ISIS. If they allow ISIS to stay in Africa and destabilize the government, they can come in as saviors and institute stability in the region. Or, you know, they can take over whatever the winner would be between the fight in ISIS and the government. It's easier to defeat an exhausted government, and it's easier to take control of a wild dog that you already know how to defeat. If Russia and China ever wanted to defeat ISIS, they could do it easily within 6 months to a year. So that's what I wanted to add. We've done a lot of research on the topic. We've done a lot of research in the instability in Africa, right, and how we can help to further the stability of the government there in Africa. And based on our research, I believe it's most likely that Russia and China have absolutely no interest in defeating ISIS, because it's more to their interest for ISIS to defeat the government than they go in and defeat ISIS.
Thank you very much. Okay, maybe we can start, General, with the question of, you know, besides boots on the ground, what are other ways can Uganda assist in this fight against Islamic State in Congo?
Oh, thank you very much for the good question and the concerns you have raised about the presence of Ugandan troops in DRC and Somalia. First and foremost, I don't think it would be better that we pull out of the coalition. In my view, I think that one wouldn't be solving a problem. Our being in DRC, first and foremost, has several approaches. One is that we are defending our country against the terrorists, those who are causing mayhem within the country and within DRC. And of course, they also have effects throughout the whole globe. Like we have told you that there is that collaboration and linkages between the ISCAP and the IS all over the world, and the targeted infrastructures and other interests of our regional partners must not be left unguarded. But importantly to note is that some of our being in DRC, we continue to degrade the capacity of these IS to make war. And first and foremost, I'm sure you are aware that DRC is part of the East African community, and we have to assist in the security situation of a member of the East African community. And our being there has created the environment, conducive environment for regional integration at all levels, so that trade is going on smoothly. I'm sure you would wish to know that at the moment, our Ugandan border with DRC, especially the Albertine region where we have oil interests, where oil exploration is being guarded well, and this operation Shujaa, has gone well in tandem with the construction and upgrading of more than 1,200 kilometers main road network in DRC, especially in the Bunia areas. And this has facilitated in the improvement of the mobility and trade between the two countries and the common people along the border. And of course, you must be aware that as a result of our being in DRC, we have managed to rescue several of these young children and girls who had been lured or misled into these terrorist activities and living, bordering on enslavement. And our being in, of course, you touched on the resources. Of course, you may wish to know that these IS, of course, depend on illegal economic trade, minerals, timber, and other resources, as people normally to talk about the resource cuts or the paradox of plenty in DRC. So whoever is there, I think there is that tendency of people think that when you are there for a good cause on security issues, because of that paradox of the plenty, people tend to associate it with the rooting and plundering, but we are aware that IS is doing that. Our being in Somalia is very pertinent, and I think we are still there, and we shall be there not until the expiry of ATMIS. But we initially, before we went to Somalia, you realize that Al-Qaeda had made a praying ground, Kampala and Uganda, a praying ground for its terrorist activities, but we followed them to the source. And in spite of a few hiccups here and there, like the incident that happened last week, it does not demoralize us, and we are helping our friendly Somali people along Pan-Africanism context to make sure that they enjoy the stability as an African state. And that's right.
Perfect. Okay. We're going to give 1 minute. I'm sorry, we're not giving quite as much time to this question, but we need to wrap up. We had a question about the links between the ADF and local groups. I'm happy to answer that, but I think it would be better to go with one of the panelists, since if any of you guys want to take that.
No, please do take that, Tara. I mean, I just wanted to add to General's point. If the UPDF doesn't fight ISIS in Congo or in Somalia, they will fight ISIS inside Uganda. When the Boko Haram crisis started, for example, Chad did not fight along with the Nigerian army. They thought it's a Nigerian problem. And then Boko Haram started attacking Chad, and it became a Chadian problem. So Uganda would do better to fight them outside its soil because the ideology is expansionist, it's inherently expansionist. I mean, on the question of communities being cut off, I mean, you have mentioned some of the reasons. There are three main reasons. Number one, by cutting off communities, ISWAP feels, and other groups also do it, that they can make young people in those communities more vulnerable to join them, because if they don't have access, they are hungry and they can offer them food or some money, then they would join them. I mean, the same thing is the plan with targeting humanitarian organizations, to flush them out so there will be no one giving charity except the armed groups. The second is to counter government claims of defeating the groups. So it's like countering government messaging, because governments will say we have defeated them, and then they strike one community and it becomes not true. The final is by striking towns and villages, they are able to establish what is called semi-territorial presence. They would be able to scare people enough that people will then start paying taxes to them and will start withholding information from intelligence from government officials and feeding them with information against troops, so that they would continue to operate in those areas. So these are some of the reasons why we see attacks like the ones you mentioned.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to wrap up. The quick answer is we don't see any real proof of links, but I'm happy to discuss that with you at the break. We've got about a 10-minute break, and then we'll be I hope you'll stick around. We have a short film that we'll be showing. It's from the defectors' point of view, so interviewing people who have come out of the Islamic State in Congo, using footage from the group to try to show what's happening inside the group and that transition there. So we'll be back in 10 minutes to do that. Thank you so much to our panelists.